Most of us are familiar with leadership development as a process for helping individuals become better. Of late, many organizations have turned their attentions to a little bit higher level, and that is, how do we help teams become more effective? I'm going to today with you urge you to think with me about a third level, and that is, not only is what we do pertain to people's personal performance and behavior and their effectiveness on a team, but it really also affects the organizations. Organizations are more than a mere sum of their parts. And we are going to talk today about this simple idea that if you want to change an organization, one way of thinking about that is to change its culture. Now, the word culture is used a great deal. And so I'm going to ask you to begin by just engaging in a quick little exercise. To the other people sitting at your table, I want you to tell at least two or three of them the two attributes about the organization in which you are currently working, the two attributes that you really love. What is it about your organization that just really inspires you? And then also tell them, what's the one thing about the organization that you don't like so well, that you wish were different? I don't want to say that you hate, but I mean, what would you change? So you got about 3 minutes to do that, so go quick. Okay, your time is up. And what I would now like to hear from many of you is, what are the kinds of things that you talked about? So let me just hear, shout out if you would, what is it that you love about the organization you currently work with? Helping other people. Emphasis on quality. The camaraderie inside the organization. Flexibility of the organization. Passion. Collaboration. Couple more? Customer focus. And now let me just switch to the other side for a second. What were the things that you weren't quite so happy about? What would you change?
Stuck in the past.
Stuck in the past. Lack of commitment. Change averse. A little bit stuck in the past. Okay. Couple more. Slowness, just the pace. One more. Expanding too rapidly and losing the culture. Okay. There is, to my knowledge, no really official definition of this term culture. I got up a few minutes early this morning and went to a book that I had read many years ago, and I'd remembered as being one of the more profound books in terms of shaping my own thinking about this topic of culture. It is called Corporate Culture and Performance, written by two Harvard professors. And they make a couple of interesting comments. By the way, it reminded me of something which I wish I had remembered more often through my life, and that is, I'm very prone to look for the latest book and the newest faddish book. And then I go back and reread some of the great classics, and I say, why didn't I spend my time reading that? And I opened this book, and I was thinking about this question of what is culture. At the deeper level and less visible level, culture refers to values that are shared by the people in the group and that tend to persist over time, even when the group membership changes. But then they go on to say, but at the more visible level, it's what is the behavior that new employees are automatically encouraged to follow by their colleagues. So what are the unwritten rules? How are things done around here? So what is culture? I guess I'm going to say it's behavior that's consistent over the time. As one person said, it's the smell of the place. It's how we do things around here. So there's lots of definitions of culture. Is it important? Why is culture important? The thing that always stuck out to me about this book was that Cotter and Heskett made the case that culture really did make a difference, that it truly shaped their performance. And what they had done was to go back in time and look at different industries, the airline industry, the banking industry, manufacturing, high technology, various kinds of industries. And they found a list of companies who were roughly the same size, had about the same assets at one point in time, and then a few years later began to diverge dramatically. So what separated American Airlines and Pan Am, for example? How many people here even remember who Pan Am was? Maybe a few of you do. What separated Westinghouse and General Electric? What separates organizations? Why do they diverge in such dramatic ways? And the argument that they make here very convincingly is it is indeed the culture that develops. It explains why one company succeeds and one more fails. And yes, they would acknowledge, and I certainly would acknowledge, that there may be strategy issues and technology issues and changing economy. There may be ethical lapses. There may be mistaken, kind of strategies that are embarked upon. But as Peter Drucker said, culture eats strategy for lunch. And so culture does make a difference. And now the question is, if organizations all have a culture, they have things in them that we like, and there are some things that we don't like as much, is it possible for us to change culture? And if so, how do we go about doing that? The question about do organizations need to change their culture? I suspect that if I were to ask this group, do organizations need to change their culture? We'd all say yes. Why? Because the underlying market is changing, the economy is changing, technology is changing. I heard a number of you saying our big complaint about the culture we have now is that we're kind of slow to act, slow to move, stuck in the past, averse to change. So it's clear that a lot of you are saying the thing about my organization that I don't applaud and don't revere so much is it's being stuck in the past. And you look at some industries today, look at what's happening to the world of retailing. Holy smokes. Particularly the book world. It was just a few years ago that you began to see the percentage of books being sold by Amazon and Barnes & Noble begin to do that. And now we all know that the story of what's happening to book retailing. And sure, will some very innovative local bookstores survive? Absolutely. But the huge changes in retailing, particularly. The last issue of The Economist has a whole center section about how shopping malls are decreasing in size, decreasing in tenancy, and the percentage of online shopping is just dramatically changing. And what that's going to do to the overall retailing economy, especially since retail is 1 out of every 9 jobs here in the United States. Why do people get stuck in the past? They wait too long because changing means walking away from a business model that they've all grown up with. It means walking away from patterns of behavior that have been long ingrained in us. And, very often, people in senior positions know no other way. They haven't seen a different style or a different approach or a different culture exist. It's fascinating to look at the statistics from the Fortune 500 and S&P 500. The Fortune 500 was created in the year that I graduated from college, 1955. 500 companies were selected. It happened that all of them at that time were in the manufacturing arena. There were not service organizations. The average company on the Fortune 500 lasted for about 75 years when it was originally on that list. Any idea what it is today? It's down to 14 and a half years. Now, the Fortune 500 list is a little deceptive because in 1990 they changed the rules of the game and that they now allowed service organizations to become part. And so about 60% were changed in one kind of fell swoop. The S&P 500 is probably a better kind of litmus test of what we're talking about. It's been around for a long time. There's about a century of data for that. Same pattern. Organizations used to be on the S&P 500 for about 75 years. Then it dropped down to about 20 years. They're estimating now that the average one will be there at most 14 years. which means that in the next 10 years, there'll be a turnover of 1/2 will be gone, and a whole new group will be part of the S&P 500. So if an organization wants to change its culture, what can it do? And I know there's a bunch of really smart and very experienced people here, so give me a couple of your ideas. How can an organization go about changing its culture? Change the leader. So bring in someone from the outside, or replace the person who's in charge now with somebody who thinks differently, who's had different experiences. And as my son, who's a professor of strategy, is fond of saying, often the new leader has the benefit of having the strength of weak ties. He or she has no allegiance to the past and to the individuals who are there. So he or she is able to come in and kind of make changes that the predecessor just didn't have the heart or the perspective to make. What else can you do? How do you change culture? Mandate behavior change. You will be nicer. You will be more innovative. You will be more whatever. You can reorganize. We've all seen organizations who wanted to change things. It's like a bunch of little birds in a cage that are all perched on little perches, and so you bang on the side of the cage, and the birds all fly around, and they land on new perches, and voila, you've reorganized. Does that change cultures? Can have some effect. Probably doesn't have the long-lasting and greatly pervasive effect that we would all like. So anyway, new executive, restructuring, campaigns, change the behavior of senior leaders somehow, culture, because culture is behavior. And finally, the one I would like to just toss out to you is not my idea, but it was an observation made by Jack Welch, the well-known former CEO of GE, who said, if you want to change an organization, change the way it develops its leaders. And he was the guy that put a lot of attention to that, really kind of emphasized Crotonville and all that it could do to help train generations of leaders to lead their organization. So, if you want to change an organization, change the way it develops its leaders. Let me just stop and just have you think with me about the principles of that kind of change that needs to take place. One of the things that Cotter and Heskett talk about, and that is, you can't do this in one big fell swoop. And I guess the metaphor that occurs to me, maybe as a parent of a number of kids who went through orthodontia, it's a slow, painstaking, painful, if you tried to accomplish in a week or a day the ultimate change, you would clearly crack lots of jaws and cause lots of pain and discomfort and destruction. So if you do it gradually, by applying the right kind of pressure and the right kind of influences, you can make wonderful changes in the way kids' teeth come together. So think orthodontia in terms of change. And think about the fact that, just as we found out from our little exercise here, most of us work in organizations that have some qualities that we love, and then there may be one or two things that we don't like so much. So no culture is all good or all bad. And so it's the opportunity to kind of focus on the bad elements and see what you can do to kind of change those. Culture is behavior that can be changed, and it certainly works best when you go about that process in some kind of a social context, in a social activity. One of the things that occurred to me as I was trying to do some reading on this subject of change and culture change particularly was this interesting notion of there are precursor behaviors. And by precursor behaviors, there are things that you need to kind of set the stage and set the groundwork in order to prepare for the ultimate change that you want to make. I guess one metaphor that always has resonated with me is, in my lifetime, I've painted lots of bedrooms and parts of apartments and houses. And I've always been impressed that the most difficult part of that whole process was not getting a bucket of paint and a brush and putting paint on the wall, but it was all the work that goes into the preparation. It's all the sanding, and it's all the kind of filling the cracks, and it's all kind of getting ready. And unless you do that, no amount of slapping on paint is going to make the final product look all that wonderful. But if you do take the time to do the precursor behaviors, then you can have a wonderful final outcome. And by precursor behaviors, I'm talking about organizations that have wanted to instill a greater consciousness around safety, have found that the place to begin is housekeeping. Are things straight? Are they put away? Are floors swept? And so it's interesting how that beginning stages of just practicing better housekeeping become such a precursor to more effective safety practices. If you want to improve innovation, make it okay to fail. Get your executives to stand up and talk about not only all their successes and their wonderful kind of conquests, but to talk about their failures. Jack Welch used to kind of on occasion repeat the story of him burning down a chem lab in GE when he was working in there. He was a PhD chemist by background and training. And the willingness to talk about things that didn't always succeed becomes kind of a license then for people to say, okay, if you want innovation, you know that there's going to be failure. Therefore, if you want innovation, you need to be willing to kind of tolerate a certain amount of failure and make that legitimate and make people understand that the very best of us fail when we're trying new things. Want to improve the customer experience? Get the organization to talk about things that they're doing on a daily basis that really delight the customers with whom you work. So this notion of precursor behavior is one that I would just kind of toss out to you. So following Welch's kind of suggestion about if you want to change the culture, change the leadership, let me talk about what might we do. I'm going to ask you to do one more exercise at your table. Tell each other what you know about leadership development that you think is wrong with it. What's wrong with some of the practices that you see going on in the corporate world today in terms of how we go about developing our leaders? I want to hear just a couple of things from the tables. What did you talk about? What's wrong with leadership development today? No follow-up. One-time thing, one and done. Lack of accountability for the people that are the managers or the participants that are going through it. It is seen as something different than your real job. There's my real job over here, and there's leadership development over here. And if there's a conflict between those two, I'm a conscientious corporate citizen. I always work on my job. I take my job. My job comes first. Okay, it's clear that there are things that we all know could be done better. There have been lots of criticisms, not tied to organizational strategy. We don't learn from work experience. We don't teach methods that change behavior. Managers are not involved, no measurement of improvement. So the list goes on and on and on. We could spend a similar amount of time talking about what are the successes. And I'm here to say to you, we've got very good data that shows that there are successes. We do know that people can change. That is the fundamental bedrock of what we're all about. And personality change has been studied. There was an era of psychology, and especially when I was going through undergraduate psychology training, that we had this belief that personality was very fixed. And certainly there's a strong, extensive body of data now that shows that's just not true. People do make significant changes later in their lives. Change is indeed very, very possible. We have good data that people that have fatal flaws, if you provide for them some kind of development experiences and you measure again at a later time, people with fatal flaws can make huge differences. In fact, the differences that they make are greater than the differences that people who are without fatal flaws because they're starting from a lower space. At the same time, we know that people without fatal flaws start at a higher level, 60th percentile. You come back 12 months to 18 months later and retest them, and they have higher scores, which indicates that, yeah, people really do change their behavior. How do we then see the way that impacts the people that they manage? And again, we have data that talks about the level of employee engagement of the people reporting to those leaders who went through that change process. And we see that the employee engagement scores go from 57th percentile to the 70th percentile. So it changes them, and their behavioral change impacts the organization, the people in it. So I would argue that we all know that leaders have a strong influence on organizations' behavior. We know that leaders influence customer satisfaction, employee engagement, productivity, innovation. The list keeps just going on and on and on. Everything that we can objectively measure is strongly influenced by the quality of the leader. What is it then that we can do if the leaders are essentially the rudder of the ship? Are there some things that we can do to make sure the dimensions of the rudder are precisely correct? We have the most effective, the most well-designed rudder to guide this ship through very kind of, difficult times, through difficult pathways. And the answer is yes, they do. The leaders shape the culture, and we can help shape the leaders, given the right kind of efforts on our part. So to do what I'm going to propose involves taking risk. It involves kind of us being bolder. It involves us ensuring that the content of what we develop and the way we provide it is using the most powerful and helpful techniques possible. But I would suggest to you that there are maybe 7 things that we might do to improve what we refer to as this broad leadership development activity. And I'm going to single out 2 or 3 to talk about more, but just think about, we do know how to improve the quality of leadership development, which in turn improves leaders' behavior, which in turn changes the culture of the organization. And that's the fundamental message I'm wanting to convey. That not only does leadership development change individuals and changes teams, but it has the potential for shaping the culture of the organization. The first one I've mentioned here is delivery. And I know I'm preaching to the choir. There are traditional kinds of delivery, and there are much more powerful kinds. I think we all know in our heart of hearts that things that are highly experiential, that what we're in the business of doing is not just giving people new ideas and new thoughts, but we're changing behavior. And unless we use very powerful learning methods that afford people the opportunity to rehearse and practice, we aren't going to change behavior. So we need to kind of move toward that. We talked earlier about building development into work. There has been this long-held belief that here's my job, and here's potential development opportunities. And as we mentioned, if those ever come into conflict, and they do all the time, most people choose the job. What if we made people understand, or help people understand, that the job and their development are not separated? That my job is the perfect laboratory, it's the perfect classroom for me to learn how to build relationships, or to be more strategic in my thinking, or to practice better collaboration. So we can build work and development and have them occur together, remove that conceptual barrier. Combining development and work, here's a bunch of ideas about it. I'm happy to share with you some articles and blogs that we've written about this, but you can combine those two. The third thing that one of you mentioned earlier about what do we do involving our managers. We have good data that says, and this was a perceptual study. If you ask people their perceptions of their level of support that they have from their manager, and you ask them about their perceptions of the degree to which they've improved as a leader, and if you combine those 2 scores, how much have I improved as a leader, and what was the level of my manager's support, this is the data. That if I've got an unsupportive manager, I'm at the 33rd percentile in terms of how I perceive my own progress. If I have a very supportive manager, I'm nearly in the top quartile in terms of my perceived change as a consequence of development. The fourth thing I'd want to just quickly mention is many of our organizations spend a lot of time and attention on developing competency models that become the driving force, the skeleton of what they're doing in their leadership development. But they reside there. They're encapsulated there. What if organizations saw the great opportunity to embed those exactly same competencies and practices in their selection process, in their promotion process, in their compensation practices, in their onboarding practices? What if we made sure that those same principles were being applied universally through all the interactions that people have? Making HR systems consistent, we think, is a major opportunity. A quick observation I would make is, who's responsible for development? I've been around long enough that I've seen organizations put that onus on the HR department. I've been around long enough to see it kind of negated and said, no, it's on the individual. He or she is responsible for their own development. It's all up to them. I've heard talk about managers being responsible or external coaches. You know, if you're playing on a local softball team and you're having fun and you're in a little community league and you want your team to succeed, it's clear that you want every other player on the team to be playing at his or her best. Who's responsible for our development? We are collectively responsible for each other's development. And I should be as concerned and interested in the development of my boss, my colleague in a different department, my subordinate, and myself. We're all in this together. And if we can change that mentality that this is a village, not an individual responsibility. Joe and I talk frequently, and one of the things that we smile about is we see organizations that have 10,000 people, maybe 100,000 people. We see organizations who very proudly talk about their leadership development program, and as they talk to us about what they're planning to do next year, they're planning to have 2 groups of 15 people go through their development process. And we scratch our heads and think, do you really believe that's going to change the organization, particularly changing its culture? There's been lots of talk in communities about immunization of children. Some parents think that immunization causes autism, so they don't let their kids be immunized. And their argument is, well, it's my responsibility, it's my child, it's my business, it's not your business. But is it the community's business? And the answer is yes, it is. Because if you don't immunize your child and your child comes down with measles and interacts with all the kids in the class, that child affects everybody. Apply that same argument to our corporations, our organizations. If we don't train leaders, and if we have this underlying philosophy that every employee has the right to come to work and be managed by a really good manager, but if we don't do anything to develop those managers and that they're not all that good, does that affect the herd? And the answer is absolutely it does. And herd immunity comes when you reach 90%. Peter Drucker said, if you want to change an organization, you've got to get to at least a third or a half of the managers. You've got to impact them, or it isn't going to have the change on the overall organization. I would submit to you that as you think about your organizations, and you look at the wonderful qualities they have, and you also look at a couple of things that you wish could be changed. If we're clear about what those changes need to be, I would submit to you that we can focus on those and deliberately create developmental experiences through which our managers can participate that will have the potential of bringing about the kind of change that we seek. Whether it's better collaboration or risk-taking or innovation or being, not being stuck in the past or being more candid, whatever that outcome that you would seek, I would submit to you that you can address that through this vehicle of leadership development. It's based on some foundational skills, which are coaching skills and feedback skills and being inspiring and motivating and using data to kind of drive decisions. But we can shape the behavior. We can change the rudder so that it really guides the ship in the right direction. Frances Hesselbein is a friend of mine. Maybe I respect her so much because she's a few years older than I am, and she still comes in the office every day and is working full steam. So I really admire her a lot. It is about her that Peter Drucker said she is the best executive I've ever worked with. She was the president of the Girl Scouts of America for a number of years. Anyway, she makes this comment: culture does not change because we desire it to change. Culture changes when the organization is transformed. The culture reflects the realities of people working together. So I hope that those thoughts have triggered something in your mind, that not only can we change individuals and change teams, but through what we do, we can truly change the culture of the organizations with which we work. Thank you.